I'd love for you to talk about how to control a conversation and how to ask better questions. Because as a podcast host, I'm also curious.
Absolutely. It's funny, Doug, because, listening to some of your podcast interviews and being here with you now, it does give me a sense like, I would assess, not assume, but I would assess that it's not always easy for you to host a podcast, that it's actually it takes a bit of effort for you to come up with what questions you want to ask and making sure that the question that you're asking is relevant and congruous with the previous question that you just asked. How much of that assessment is accurate?
It's pretty accurate. Like I never like to phone it in, and I just care a lot about what I do, and I want to make sure that I'm asking questions that are kind of different, but that also are valuable to the people that are listening to or watching my show.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's funny because the only reason that I've been able to make that assessment at all is because we've been able to build a baseline during this time together, and I could build a baseline from watching your other interviews, right? So let's talk about controlling a conversation first, because controlling a conversation is very closely tied with asking effective questions or asking what you might call better questions. So controlling a conversation is first about understanding who's actually in control of a conversation. Most people think the person in control of a conversation is the person who talks the most. In reality, the person in control of a conversation is the person who asks the most questions. So in our interview together, Doug, who's in control of this conversation?
I am.
You are. That means that you can control what we talk about next. You can control how long the conversation lasts. You can control my energy level in this conversation because you control the questions. When you ask a question, you can decide whether that question takes us in a new direction, takes us deeper into the same direction, whether that question takes us in a direction where I am interested and excited, or whether it takes us into a direction where I'm less interested and maybe more mellow. So it's super important for anybody out there who wants to learn how to control a conversation. The secret sauce is talk less and ask more questions. Now, once you understand that the question is the magic sauce to controlling a conversation, then the next thing you have to understand is that there's two different types of questions. There's open questions or open-ended questions and closed-ended questions. Most people will make the mistake of asking close-ended questions because they're very focused on trying to reach a certain conclusion. So a closed-ended question is a question that can be answered with a simple yes/no response, right? If it can be answered with one word, then it's a closed-ended question, right? What's your favorite color? Green. Did you like that restaurant? Yes. What's your favorite ethnic food? Korean food. These are all closed-ended questions. There's no critical thinking that's required. There's no way of gaining information from your targets. With an open-ended question, the whole objective is to gain more information than what you give. Because information is the true currency of any relationship. The more information you can collect about someone else, the more power you have in that relationship, the closer and the more perceived loyalty that person has to you, because they believe that they are giving you more information because you are someone that can be trusted with that information. So now instead of saying, what's your favorite ethnic food? You can say, what regions of the world create the food that you're most interested in? Oh, well, I really like food from India and from Asia. Oh, can you tell me more about why you like those foods? Right? So now we're asking questions that are not binary, questions that can't be answered in one word. And what that turns into is people talking about their travel. They're talking about their first date. They're talking about their palate. They're talking about, I like Indian food because it's something I can't cook at home because I'm not a very good cook. And unless it comes out of a box or a microwavable tray, I don't really make anything. This is all information that we start to gather from people because we're asking open-ended questions. So a real quick rule of thumb, if you're asking a question that is what or who or do, like do you know how or do you know when, if you're asking a question that starts with do, who, or what, you're asking a closed-ended question. If you're asking a how or why question, you're asking an open-ended question, right? How did you first learn about Chinese food versus do you like Chinese food, right? Binary versus open-ended. And it's going to turn into a much larger conversation where the other person talks more and you direct where you go next because of the next question that you ask. So I'll take a break there because that's a lot of information. But essentially, controlling a conversation is all about understanding the kinds of questions that you're going to ask and then asking the right type of effective question.
And then as a follow-up, when you're asking an open-ended question and somebody gives you their response, I guess this more so applies to personal relationships, but I'm sure professional too, but to avoid the other person feeling like they're being like grilled or interrogated or interviewed, is there a helpful way to validate what they're saying in a short but sweet way, so that way that person isn't going on and on with, speaking about themselves, but they're also able to, again, validate and then punt it back to the other person to follow up on what they were saying?
Yeah, and it's a great point, because what you never want to do when you control a conversation, you never want to make the other person feel like they are under control, because that's going to shape their response. If someone feels like they're in a conversation where they're being interrogated or they're being questioned or they're being directed, then that's going to make them take more defensive action and more defensive sense of responses. So to your point, the way that you bury your intention or hide your intention to control a conversation is through a process that we call 2 questions and a validation, right? So 2 questions and a response, basically. So you ask a question, and then you ask a related follow-up question, and then instead of asking a third question, you validate or confirm what the other person just said. So as an example, if you're talking to somebody and you say, where did you first learn about painting? And they say, oh, I first learned about painting when I was a child because my mom used to paint, on the front patio. Oh, what did your mom paint on the front patio? Oh, my mom always painted the sunrise over the cornfields because she loved the view from the front patio. Well, this is a point now where you've asked 2 questions that are related to each other to try to direct a conversation. You don't want to ask a third question, because now if you ask a third question, you start highlighting to the person that you're prying into their private life. So instead, you want to validate and confirm what they say. So then you might validate that by saying, my grandmother used to paint also, and she would love to paint beach scenes because the beach is someplace that made her happy. Period. No question, no statement, or no question, no follow-up needed. All you're doing is validating the experience that the other person said.
CIA believes that all people are born with a spy secret superpower. For some people, that means they can win deals. For others, they can spot liars. Some can even seduce lovers. I built a free 3-minute test to help reveal to you exactly what your secret hidden superpower is. All you have to do is click on the link in the description below, take the test, and start using your spy superpower to stay ahead of 99% of people.
And you can validate them by saying the same thing, like agreeing with them, or you can validate them by telling them something totally opposite, right? Wow, nobody in my family ever painted at all. It's always been something that I was interested in, but I never had a chance to learn. So now you're not agreeing with the person, you're just validating, you're confirming for them that you are listening to the words that they're saying. And then once you make your confirmation, oftentimes what will happen is that person will give you more information. Right? And that person will say something like to the extent of, yeah, my mom has always loved to paint. It's something that always helped her relax. And she had a very stressful life, raising 3 kids and being a nurse. And now, boom, you're primed for another question. Do you see that? So
Yeah.
2 questions will always lead to more information. And if you do a statement of fact as a confirmation, 9 times out of 10, the person will respond with more information that leads to more questions, but they'll never feel like they're under control, and they'll never feel like they're being interrogated.
Out of all the skills that you've learned and acquired as a former CIA agent and spy, which ones do you think are most applicable to somebody who's interested in improving their mental health or health and wellness and is into personal development?
Wow, there's two answers that come to my mind right away, right? And the first one has to do with understanding the difference between perception and perspective. Because what happens is most of us don't realize that perception and perspective are two different things. Perception is how you see the world around you. Perspective is how other people see the world around you. So, for example, when you're sitting there at a dinner table across from your spouse or across from your friend or across from your kids, the way that you see the dinner table, the way that you taste that dinner, the way that you feel the temperature in the room, all of that is your perception. Your children, your spouse, your partner, your friend, they all have a completely different perception of what's happening at that dinner table. So when you are able to see the dinner table and the room from their point of view, that means you have gained a greater perspective. And there's a huge advantage in having perspective, because once you have perspective, you're closer to the objective truth about what's happening in that moment. Whereas as long as you're trapped in your own perception, you're literally stuck in your own subjective reality, which isn't as accurate or complete as the other people in the room. So that's the first answer that comes to my mind. But when you talk specifically about people who are trying to pursue self-improvement, or people who are trying to overcome anxiety, or people who are trying to control more of the world around them, equally as important as understanding the difference between perception and perspective is understanding the reality, or what we call the anatomy of fear, and where fear actually comes from. Because fear is not what most of us think it is. We think it's some kind of uncontrollable response that just happens in our subconscious. In reality, fear is a mental process. It's a process that starts with some sort of external input, and that external input then goes through a very predictable scientific chemical response in our brain, where it is then translated into some kind of fear response. So as an example, I'm sure you've had a moment where you've been startled by something that you saw. You thought you saw a rat in the corner, or you thought you saw a snake on the ground. And in an instant, your heart rate shot up, you started to sweat, you become very afraid of this one thing, until you look at it closer and you realize it's just a dirty pair of socks in the corner, not a rat. Or it's just a stick on the ground with a certain shadow, not a snake. That process that happened in your brain, that went from immediate panic until this, just a few seconds later, this moment of clarity, that's a chemical predictable response in the human brain. And you can actually learn to manage your fear and manage your anxiety better when you understand that process and how it works in your brain, because you can practice the process of slowing down the chemical reaction. So I know that's a whole lot of terminology in a very short period of time, Doug, but when you ask that question, you got two simultaneous answers in my brain.
Let's unpack the perception versus perspective, because we all have our biases. We all have our own interests and values and our beliefs around the world, and we craft our behaviors and our actions based on that. How can somebody improve so that they can maintain their own sense of identity while being able to gain perspective so that they can improve themselves as they interact with other people?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a great question. So when you talk about having your own set of biases and our own worldview, what the term is that we use at the agency is exactly that. We call it a worldview. That is your worldview. Your worldview is shaped by your religion. It's shaped by how you grew up. It's shaped by what neighborhood you went through puberty in. It's shaped by where you went to college. Your worldview is shaped by all of these different inputs, and it becomes the lens, like glasses, right? It becomes the lens that you see everything through. So I'm sure you've met somebody who's very Christian. They see everything through a very Christian lens. I'm sure you've met people who are African American and they see the world through a very African American lens. I'm sure you've met people who are wealthy and they see the whole world through a very wealthy lens. All of that worldview is something that can be shaped and changed because your brain isn't as concrete as people think it is. The brain has a function called neuroplasticity, which means that it can be changed, it can be reframed, it can be reshaped, it can be programmed, deprogrammed, reprogrammed. So your brain is this very malleable thing. But what it takes to change it which is the heart of your question, Doug, what it takes to change the way that your brain works. It takes new experiences, and it takes a willingness to accept what's known as cognitive dissonance. Cognitive dissonance is when you learn something new that challenges part of your original worldview. So it's the very thing that most of us find very irritating about people who don't change. When you talk to somebody who's hyper-Christian and you ask them questions about where their faith is in contradiction to their life, oftentimes what you find is that you make the person very defensive. What you're doing is you're introducing cognitive dissonance, but they're not open to that dissonance, so their neuroplasticity is not kicking in. Instead, they're rejecting that cognitive dissonance. They're doubling down, or they're burying themselves even further in their entrenched beliefs, and they're resisting change. The same thing happens in the workplace. The same thing happens in the family. The same thing happens in relationships. When people don't accept cognitive dissonance, they don't trigger that neuroplasticity. They don't change their worldview. So the number one thing to somebody who wants to change their worldview is you have to be willing to be open to those moments where new information challenges your fundamental beliefs. And you have to just take a second, literally it's moments of time, to consider the new information and consider how it challenges your original information, and let that discomfort sit for a while instead of becoming defensive or rejecting it outright. As you go through that practice more and more, what you'll find is that it becomes easier and easier to accept new information and to start challenging your old beliefs based off of the new information so that you can come to a more complete point of view. Not necessarily that your worldview has to change, but that your worldview has to accept a new point of view in order to grow more confident, more capable, or more objectively accurate.
When it comes to having conversations with people with different points of view, that often becomes a challenge for people. Tough conversations are tough for people. We talk a lot about communication on the podcast. What tips do you have for somebody who's just trying to improve their conversation skills with somebody that maybe they don't see eye to eye with, they don't align with, but they're trying to form some sort of bond or relationship with them? What kind of skills should they try to acquire?
Yeah, so there's two important things here that you have to understand. One, when you're talking to somebody who isn't open to cognitive dissonance, there is no value in challenging their point of view. So you're investing energy and investing time into something with a negative return on investment. So if you're talking to somebody who isn't open to a new point of reference, don't waste your time trying to convince them that they are wrong or trying to convince them that they need to change their point of view. Do not do that. That's what most of us do. It's a complete waste of time. Instead, recognize early that they are unwilling to change. And then once you recognize that they are unwilling to change, the most useful thing that you can do is start to adopt their point of view. If you are the one who's open to changing your worldview, especially if you're willing and open to changing your worldview on a case-by-case basis, meaning right now I'm talking to somebody who is pro-Israel, and they're never going to see the Palestinian plight as a valid plight. So regardless of how I feel, I will adopt a pro-Israel point of view for this conversation. We as communicators need to be willing to take that step instead of standing on this principled soapbox preaching that everyone else needs to change their point of reference. No, you as the communicator need to take responsibility for the fact that if you want to communicate effectively, you have to change to match the other audience and where they are at that moment. So the first thing we need to do is be willing to recognize that if our audience is not open to a new point of view, don't fight it. That's the first step. The second step is then actively practicing this process of neuroplasticity and changing your perception into perspective so that you can adapt to the point of reference that the audience has. That's going to help you be that much more effective in getting your point across, building some sort of relationship, establishing trust, making the sale, whatever it is that you're trying to accomplish through communication.